Imagine a hot, humid night in Florida, the kind of heat that makes your skin stick to your clothes and the air feel thick like molasses. The Gulf waves lap lazily against the shore, a sound that should be funny. But there's something wrong. A low hiss, almost a whisper, that doesn't belong to the sea. That's where the story begins, in a moment that seems ordinary, but carries the weight of a nightmare about to unfold. A woman is alone on the beach at dusk, her feet sinking into the warm sand, when her eyes find something half buried. It is not a broken shell or a piece of wood washed in by the tide. It's an old, cracked clown mask, with painted eyes that seem alive, following your every movement. She picks it up, an unexplained shiver running up her spine, and takes it home, thinking it's just a curious find. Little does she know that this simple thing will trigger a year of torment, where the line between reality and madness crumbles like sandcastles at high tide. That woman is Eleanor, or Ellie as some call her, a strong-willed retiree, former art teacher who spent decades shaping young minds with brushes and stories. Now, live alone in a modest house near the beach, surrounded by the silence that the years have brought. Ellie is curious to the point of stubbornness, with a sharp memory that makes her relive the past in vivid detail. But she also carries a shadow, a tendency to doubt herself when the world around her begins to fall apart. Her conflict is clear as day. She wants to believe that she still controls her life, that the years have not weakened her, but she fears that age has made her fragile, vulnerable to forces she does not understand. When he takes a mask home, his goal is simple: discover where that strange artifact came from, a mystery to occupy his restless mind. But each step in this quest drags her deeper into an abyss she never imagined existed, a place where the sea whispers secrets and the sand holds memories that never sleep. Get ready, because what comes next won't leave you alone anytime soon. The sun hung low on the horizon, an orange disk melting into the Gulf of Mexico, as the warm breeze carried the smell of salt and rotting seaweed down the Florida coast. It was late afternoon, the kind of time when seagulls made their last low flights before settling down, and the heat of the day still clung to the sand, rising in invisible waves that made her skin itch. She walked slowly, her features sinking into the soft beach, the sound of the waves lapping lazily against the shore like a lullaby that never ended. It had been her daily ritual since retiring had left her with more time than she knew what to do with. A former art teacher, now a gray-haired woman seeking something in the solitude of the beach that the silent walls of her home could not offer. The house was a few blocks away, a modest building of white clapboard faded by the sun and salt spray, with a low roof and a porch where she sometimes drank iced tea, listening to the portable radio that had recently tuned to something other than static. She liked the proximity of the sea, even if sometimes the sound of the waves reminded her of things she'd rather forget. The years they shaped young minds, the voices of the students that filled her classroom, and the emptiness that came after. His life was now made up of small habits, reading art books, organizing shells he found on the beach, and walking at dusk to feel like he was still part of the world. That night, however, the air felt different. There was a sticky humidity that stuck the light blouse to her back, and the wind brought a strange suggestion, a hiss that didn't match the natural rhythm of the sea. She frowned, adjusting the glasses that slid down her sweaty nose, and walked steadily, her eyes scanning the sand for something to break the monotony. Then he saw it. A half-buried object near the tide line, where white foam lapped at the shore before receding. It was not a broken shell, nor a piece of wood washed up by the current. It was something man-made, something that was not transmitted there. She stopped, tilting her head. A curiosity, that stubborn spark that makes you spend hours researching painting techniques or explaining the symbolism of a canvas to your students, lit up in your chest. He stepped forward, the damp sand giving way under his weight, and bent down to get a closer look. It was a mask. It's not a cheap carnival mask, the kind kids wore on Halloween, but something older, heavier. Made of weathered wood, cracked at the edges as if it had weathered decades of sun and salt. It had a crooked smile, painted in faded red, almost brown, and black eyes that looked like deep holes drilled into the surface. The paint was peeling, but the contours were still sharp, giving the mask an expression that teetered between comical and disturbing. She reached out her hand, hesitantly. The wind blew harder, kicking up grains of sand that stung his legs, and for an instant he swore he heard something, a low, muffled sound, like a distant breeze held back by the breeze. She shook her head, laughing at herself. "You're getting too imaginative," he murmured, his hoarse voice lost in the noise of the waves. But the shiver that ran up his spine wasn't imagination. Her fingers touched the wood, despite the coldness of the day's heat, and she removed the mask from the sand with greater effort than she expected. It was heavy, more than a simple piece of wood should be, and the wet sand slipped between his fingers, falling in little mounds that glistened in the dim light of twilight. Standing, she turned the mask over in her hands, examining it. The interior was rough, stained with a dark hue that could be mold or something worse, and the painted eyes obviously followed her, reflecting the darkening sky. There were no strings or elastics to secure it to her face, which made her think that perhaps it was not meant to be worn, but rather displayed. A decorative piece, perhaps, or part of some forgotten ritual. His mind was already racing, as it did in his classroom days, trying to put together the puzzle. Where had that come from? An old circus, a bad joke lost to time. Florida had its stories, whispered tales of fishermen and travelers who left strange marks on the beaches, but she had never given much credence to those things. Until now. He decided to take her home. She wasn't sure why. Perhaps it was the stubbornness that made her insist on impossible projects, or the feeling that leaving the mask there would be like abandoning a piece of history. Wrap her in the towel you carried in your bag, feeling the weight against your shoulder as you walked back. The sky was now a blanket of purple, dotted with shy stars, and the sound of the sea seemed louder, more insistent, as if it were trying to say something she didn't want to hear. Arriving home, the door creaked as it opened, a sound she already knew well. The interior was cool, but the salty smell of the beach seemed to have come with it, permeating the thin curtains that swayed in the breeze from the half-open window. He turned on the living room light, a yellowish bulb that cast soft shadows on the walls, and placed a mask on the kitchen table to clean it. He took an old cloth, dampened it in the sink, and began to rub away the sand that still adhered to the wood. Grains fell to the ground, forming small piles, and the smell of salt became stronger, almost suffocating. She stopped, frowning. Was the mask wet inside? He ran his finger inside and felt a sticky texture, but the dim light revealed nothing but shadows. I finished cleaning and took a mask to the living room bookshelf, placing it between a vase of shells collected over the years and a stack of recently opened art books. He took a step back, tilting his head. She wasn't exactly pretty, but she had a presence, something that drew the eye, even if it left a knot in your stomach. A mystery for tomorrow, she told herself, trying to ignore the feeling of the painted eyes staring back at her. The night progressed, and she improved her routine, a glass of iced tea on the porch, the radio blaring old music that was barely audible, and then bed, where the ceiling fan spun lazily. Before going to sleep, I went through the living room to turn off the lights. The mask was there, motionless on the shelf, but in the dim light the smile seemed wider, the eyes deeper. She blinked uncertainly, and for a second she thought the wood had moved, as if it were breathing. "Imaginations of a lonely old woman," he murmured, turning toward the room. But sleep took a while to come, and the noise of the waves, even so far away, seemed to echo inside her head, mixed with a hiss that she couldn't explain. The morning arrived with a grey sky, heavy clouds gathering over the gulf like a blanket that promised rain but never delivered. She woke up with heavy eyes, her body stiff from a restless night. The ceiling fan hummed overhead, but the sound of the waves still echoed in his mind, louder than it should have been for a house blocks from the beach. He rubbed his temples, trying to shake off the haze of sleep, and cried out, his bare feet touching the wooden floor that creaked in protest. The feeling of something out of place following the bed, but she attributed it to imagination. After all, it wasn't the first time that a bad night's sleep left her with her nerves on edge. In the kitchen, he prepared the coffee with automatic gestures, the strong aroma mixing with the salty smell that seemed to have settled in the house. As the coffee maker gurgles, she looks out the window. The street was quiet. The neighbors were still tucked away in their morning routines, and the wind swayed the palm trees with a hint of crumpled paper. Everything seemed normal, but there was a heaviness in the air, a tension she couldn't name. He sat at the table with the steaming mug, his fingers drumming on the splintered wood, and his eyes wandered across the room to the bookshelf. There was a mask, exactly where he had left it the night before, the crooked smile and the black eyes staring into space. She frowned. Would the morning light make it seem less threatening? No, I decided. There was still something about it that bothered you, like a crooked hanging painting that you can't ignore. He decided to ignore her for now. I had plans for the day, a trip to the local market to buy fresh fruit, maybe some oranges, which were typical of Florida, and one last trip to the library to check out a new book. But before leaving, I decided to turn on the kitchen radio, a small and dusty device that I mentioned. He turned the dial, hoping to find a news station or light music to break the silence. Instead, what came was a high-pitched hiss, followed by a dissonant melody, notes from a circus organ, scratchy and crooked, as if played by a broken record. She froze, the mug halfway to her mouth. The sound was strange, out of place, but familiar in a way that made her shudder. He turned off the radio with a dry click, the silence returning like a break. "Broken junk," he muttered, but his voice shook a little. Minutes later, while I was putting on my shoes on the porch, the radio turned on by itself. The same circus music filled the house, now louder, mixed with muffled laughter that came from far away. She ran into the kitchen, her heart racing, and found the device vibrating slightly on the counter. He pulled the plug hard. The plug fell to the floor with a thud. Silence returned, but his ears rang with the echo of those laughs. He looked around, his chest tight. There was no wind, no open window that could have moved the button. "You're going crazy," she told herself, but doubt was already creeping into her mind, finding roots. He tried to focus on the routine. He took the straw bag, locked the door, and walked to the market, the sun now trying to break through the clouds with timid rays. The smell of citrus and fresh bread calmed the air a bit, and the conversations of the vendors, many of them speaking in English mixed with thick Southern or Spanish accents, brought a comforting normalcy. He bought oranges, a flavor of strawberries, and exchanged a few words with the stall owner, a woman with sun-kissed skin who always smiled. But even there, in the hustle and bustle of the market, she felt the eyes of the mask on her back, as if she had taken it with her. Back at home, he put away his shopping and decided to sweep the living room floor, a simple task to occupy his mind. It was then that he noticed. Wet, sandy footprints marked the floor, starting at the door and going all the way to the bookshelf. She stopped, the broom falling from her hands with a snap. "It doesn't make sense. I had gone out with clean shoes, and the sand on the beach didn't reach that far on its own." He approached the footprints, his heart in his throat, and saw that they ended exactly under the mask. The wood looked wet, as if it had been touched by the sea, and a drop of water ran from one of the painted eyes, dripping onto the shelf. She backed away, the air trapped in her lungs. "That's not possible," he whispered, but the facts were there, defying his logic. The afternoon passed in a haze of restlessness. She tried to read, but the words danced on the page, and the sound of the waves, now mixed with the wind that was blowing stronger, seemed to invade the house. He decided to research the mask. She sat at the table with a notepad and began to list what she knew. Old wood, faded paint, a style that resembled something theatrical. I thought of circuses, perhaps a clown lost in time, but his memories of Florida held nothing specific. I decided to go to the library the next day. There, among the dusty books and local archives, I might find a clue. At night, the radio was quiet, but the silence was almost worse. She brewed chamomile tea, the steam rising in spirals dancing in the kitchen light, and she was trying to relax. But as she passed the room, something made her stop. The mask was not on the shelf. Her stomach dropped, and she searched the room, panic rising. He found it on the kitchen table, next to the mug of tea, as if it had been placed there by invisible hands. The surface was covered in wet sand, and the smile seemed wider, more cruel. She grabbed the mask, her fingers shaking, and took it back to the bookshelf, locking it in a drawer of old books. "Stay there," he said, his voice firm despite his fear. He lay down, but sleep was a luxury that never came. The wind blew against the windows, carrying the sound of the sea, and at some point in the morning, she woke up with a start. The radio was on again, circus music filling the room, but the cord was still disconnected on the kitchen floor. She declared herself, her heart pounding, and ran to turn it off, but the button didn't respond. The muffled laughter grew, mixing with the hissing, until she hit the device hard, knocking it to the floor. The sound stopped, but the silence that remained was dense, heavy, as if something was watching her from the shadows. The next morning, exhausted, she decided she needed answers. The library would be his next stop. But as he dressed, he noticed something new. The salty smell in the house was stronger, almost suffocating, and the sand from the footprints reappeared, now spread in a circle around the bookshelf. She took the key from the drawer, opened it with shaking hands, and there was the mask, untouched, but with a dark stain on the eyes that hadn't been there before. "What are you?" he asked. But the only answer was the sound of the waves, getting closer and closer, as if the beach was crawling towards him. The morning sun struggled to break through the dark clouds gathering over the coast, casting a dull grey light through the kitchen window. She was sitting at the table, the coffee mug cooling in her hands, her eyes fixed on the drawer of the shelf where the mask was now proposed. The salty smell permeated the air, stronger than ever, mixed with a faint hint of mold that seemed to be crawling from the walls. The sand spread in a circle around the bookcase was still there, untouched since he had seen it at dawn, and the silence of the house was broken only by the distant sound of the waves. A sound that should not have come so clearly, so insistent, blocks from the beach. She doesn't sleep anymore after the radio incident. Exhaustion weighed heavily on her shoulders, but curiosity, that stubbornness that had defined her since her classroom days, kept her alert. I couldn't ignore what was happening. The footprints, the radio, the self-moving mask, everything pointed to something that defied the logic she spent her life teaching. I needed answers, and the local library, with its dusty archives and forgotten Florida stories, was the best place to start. She quickly dressed, a light blouse and comfortable pants, and grabbed a straw bag, hesitating before opening the drawer. The mask was there, the black eyes staring at her with an intensity that made her flinch. "You won't beat me," he muttered, locking the drawer with a firm click before leaving. The walk to the library was short, but the wind blowing off the Gulf made every step an effort. The palm trees swayed with a dry sound, and the moist air clung to her skin like a second layer. The city was slowly waking up, fishermen returning with their nets, the smell of fresh fish mixing with the salt of the sea. She passed a fruit stand where the owner, a woman with calloused hands and an easy smile, waved a warm "good morning." He responded with a nod, but his mind was far away, lost in the shadows of the previous night. The library was a low concrete building, painted a faded yellow reminiscent of the 1970s, with large windows that let in the dim daylight. The interior smelled of old paper and polished wood, and the silence was broken only by the hum of an old ceiling fan. She knew the place well, spending hours there when she was a teacher, researching for her classes or simply escaping the noise of the world. The librarian, a thin woman with white hair tied in a bun, looks out of a book and gives it away. "I haven't seen you around here in a while," he said, his soft voice carrying a southern Florida drawl. "I need something specific today," she replied, adjusting her glasses. "Local stories, maybe about circuses or strange things on beaches." The librarian raised an eyebrow, but was directed to a section in the back, where the regional files were stored in cardboard boxes and yellow folders. She thanked him and stomped away, her heart beating a little faster. He felt like a detective, unraveling a mystery that no one else seemed to notice. He spent hours among the papers, his fingers turning black with dust as he leafed through old mimeographed-free newspapers. The storm was mundane, reports of majorities, pier openings, recipes for lemon pie typical of the region. But then, in a box marked Oral History of the Coast, I found something. A thin booklet, the pages almost falling apart, titled Tales from the Gulf Beaches. It was a collection of stories told by longtime residents, compiled by an amateur historian in the 1950s. One passage caught his attention. The Sand Circus, a traveling troupe that stopped on the beaches of Florida in the 1920s, was famous for its sand figures, sculptures that include living ones under the moonlight. Others swear he still haunts the dunes. She read and reread the text, her pulse quickening. The description matched the mask: wood, faded paint, a clown. But what did I do that never went away? He closed the booklet, decided to carry out further research, but before leaving, he told the librarian if he knew anything about the circus. The woman frowned thoughtfully. "My grandmother talked about a strange clown when I was a child. She said he appeared on the beaches on full moon nights, but it was just a story to scare us." The response didn't help much, but it planted a seed of unrest. Back at the house, the sky was darker, the wind carrying the smell of rain that never fell. She placed the booklet on the kitchen table and began taking notes, trying to organize her thoughts. The circus, the clown, the mask. Everything seemed connected. But how? He decided to ask his neighbor, a retired fisherman who lived 2 houses away. He was known for his exaggerated stories, told with a cigar in his mouth and a glass of whiskey in his hand, but perhaps there was a grain of truth in them. He knocked on his door late in the afternoon. The sun had already hidden behind the clouds. He opened it, his sun-beaten face creasing into a smile. "Why, the teacher! What do you bring here?" She showed him the booklet and specifically the mask, watching as his smile faded. He scratched his graying beard, eyes shifting to the floor. "The clown who never left," he muttered almost to himself. "My father talked about him. He said it was bad luck to touch the things the sea leaves behind." He decided to say more, closing the door with a "be careful what you dig up" that echoed in his mind as he walked home. Night fell heavily, the air inside the house now so salty she could taste it on her tongue. He sat at the table with the booklet open, rereading the passage about the clown, when the radio turned on by itself again. The circus music came back, slower, more drawn out, as if the device was dying. She ran into the kitchen, but before you could play the radio, he stopped. In the silence, he heard something new, a scratching sound coming from the bookcase drawer. With his heart in his throat, he slowly opened it. The mask was there, but the dark smudge over the eyes had spread, and a thin crack ran across the smile as if it had been made from within. She stepped back, the notepad falling from her hands. The sound of the waves was louder, almost deafening, and through the window he saw the street lit by the moon. Something was moving outside, a tall, drawn figure covered in sand that shone like liquid silver. It had no face, just holes where the eyes should have been. She blinked, and the figure disappeared, but the window glass vibrated with a low laugh that didn't come from the wind. He locked the door, his hands shaking, and decided he could no longer ignore what was happening. The mask was not just an object. It was something alive, something that chose her, or worse, something she woke up to. The night passed like an endless nightmare, sleep slipping away from her like water slipping through her fingers. She sat on the living room couch, the dim light from the lamp casting eye-catching shadows dancing across the walls. The mask was locked in the drawer, but the scratching sound continued, low and insistent, like nails scraping wood. The salty smell in the house was now suffocating, mixed with something damp and earthy that resembled seaweed left in the sun. Outside the window, the wind howled, carrying the noise of the waves that came closer every hour, as if the sea was invading the land, creeping toward your door. She held a cold cup of tea, her trembling fingers leaving hot marks on the ceramic. The sandy figure he had seen on the street, tall, faceless, shining under the moon, still burned in his mind. It couldn't be real. It said the same thing. It was tiredness, my imagination running wild after a sleepless night, and the stories I had unearthed in the library. But the footprints on the floor, the radio, the moving mask, these things were not products of the mind. They were tender, hard and cold, like the cracked wood that now haunted her. Her stubbornness, that strength that had led her to face difficult classes and impossible projects, pushed her to continue. But a quieter, more fragile voice whispered that perhaps she had gone too far. The morning arrived with a cloudy sky, the sun hidden behind clouds that weren't made of lead. She declared herself, her muscles rigid, and decided to act. She couldn't stand still, waiting for the next sound or sight to knock her over. He took out the notepad where he had scribbled down his discoveries, the circus, the clown, the neighbor's words, and decided to look for more answers. But first, I need to face a mask. He opened the drawer with a quick movement, almost expecting it to jump out into his hands. There it was, the crack in the deeper smile, the black eyes now stained with a dark hue that seemed to pulse in the dim light. She picked it up, finding the wood cold and damp, and took it to the kitchen, placing it on the table as if it were evidence in a trial. He sat down in front of her, his heart pounding. "What do you want?" he asked, his hoarse voice echoing in the silence. I didn't expect a response, of course, but the radio turned itself on at the same moment, the circus music coming back in slow, distorted notes. She jumped up, knocking over the chair, and ran to disconnect the wire, which was already loose on the floor. The sound stopped, but the air vibrated with muffled laughter that seemed to come from all around. He looked at the mask and swore the smile was wider, the crack widening like a living mouth. I couldn't deny it any longer. This was no ordinary object. It was something attached to her, something that reacted to her presence. He decided he needed help, but who would believe it? The neighboring fisherman is already dodging away, and the librarian deals with stories like childhood legends. I thought of an old friend, a former schoolmate, who now spent his days painting coastal landscapes. He was calm, practical, but also carried a quiet loyalty that would make you trust him. Maybe I could listen to her without judging her. He picked up the phone, hesitating before discarding it, the sound of the lines screeching like a broken radio. He answered on the third ring, the deep, familiar voice bringing a momentary break. "I need to show you something," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "Something I found on the beach. I can't explain it, but it's affecting me." He was silent for a moment, then responded with a, "I'll come by in the afternoon," that was more curious than concerned. She thanked him and hung up, the weight on her chest easing a little, but as he put the mask back in the drawer, he noticed something new. Sand dripped from the painted eyes, forming small puddles on the wood of the shelf. He wiped it off with a cloth, his heart racing, but the sand returned minutes later, like tears that wouldn't stop. The afternoon arrived with a stronger wind, the palm trees bending as if trying to escape. His friend appeared in the doorway, tall and thin, his grey hair disheveled by the salty air. He carried a canvas bag full of brushes and canvases, a habit of someone who never left home without his craft. "So, what is this mystery?" he asked, the light tone contrasting with her eyes, surrounded by dark circles. She took him to the living room, opened the drawer, and showed him the mask. He leaned over, frowning, and gingerly touched the wood. "It looks old," he said, "but there's something wrong with it. I can't explain it." She outlines everything, the footprints, the radio, the figure in the street. He listened silently, his face bearing each word. "I've seen strange things around here," he said at last. "The sea holds secrets that we don't understand. Maybe it's better to throw it away." She arrived, but something stopped her. A curiosity, always hers, whispering that she would necessarily know more before giving up. "What if we take it to sea now?" he suggested, taking the mask. She nodded, and the two headed towards the beach, the sky darkening as if it knew what they were about to do. The path was tense, the wind roaring against them, carrying grains of sand that stung the skin. When they reached the beach, the waves were choppy, breaking hard against the shore. He requested the mask, ready to throw it, but the sky opened in a sudden boom. Lightning cut through the clouds, and a fine rain began, mixed with mist that rose from the sea like smoke. "Now!" he mustered, but the waves grew, a wall of water that pushed them back. The mask fell to the sand, and the fog enveloped them, thick and salty, until they could barely see each other. When it cleared, the mask was there, intact, as if the sea had been rejected. They returned home in silence, enchanted and defeated. He stood on the porch, smoking a cigarette that shook in his hands. "This isn't normal," he said, his voice low. "Whatever it is, it doesn't want to leave." She nodded, fear mixed with growing determination. "Then I'll find out what it is," they replied, their eyes fixed on the mask, now back on the shelf. He looked at her, worried, but didn't say anything else before leaving. That night, dreams found. She was on a deserted beach, the black sky streaked with lightning, and in front of her, a clown made of sand laughed as the wind tore it apart and remade it. He woke up screaming, the sheets damp with sweat-soot and sand. He ran into the living room, his heart in his throat, and found the drawer open, the mask on the floor, surrounded by a pile of sand that pulsed as if it were breathing. The radio turned on alone, the circus music now mixed with whispering voices that said words she didn't understand. He locked the mask back on, but the sound of the waves was inside the house now, echoing off the walls, and through the window he saw the sandy figure again, closer, the eye holes fixed on her. The morning light timidly entered through the window, filtered by clouds that never dissipated. She woke up on the couch, her neck stiff and her eyes burning from a night fragmented by nightmares. The dream about the sand clown still lingered in his mind, the laughter echoing like a sound that clung to the walls of memory. The room was silent, but the salty smell was stronger, now mixed with something metallic, like rusty iron. He looked at the bookshelf. The drawer was locked. The key was still in the pocket of his robe, but the sand scattered across the floor formed an irregular pattern, like footprints that led nowhere. She rubbed her eyes, trying to convince herself it was just combustion, but the weight in her chest said otherwise. He got up slowly, his bones protesting, and went to the kitchen to prepare some coffee. The radio was on the floor where he left it after the last incident, the wire hanging loose like a dead snake. He didn't dare touch him. As the coffee maker hissed, she opened a window, hoping the fresh air would clear the smell that permeated the house. But the wind brought only more salt, more moisture, and a low sound that wasn't the waves. A whisper, almost words, that was lost before she could understand them. He slammed the window shut, the glass shaking in its frame, and decided he needed a plan. The attempt to throw the mask into the sea failed, and the dreams, the sand, the visions, everything was getting worse. Her stubbornness kept her standing, but a doubt, that fragility she tried to hide, crept deeper. She sat at the table with her coffee, her notebook open in front of her. The notes about the circus and the clown were no longer insufficient, pieces of a puzzle that didn't fit together. The painter friend was clear. The mask didn't want to leave. But why? And why her? I thought about seeking help beyond him, someone who understood the mysteries that Florida hid beneath its beaches and swamps. He remembered a woman from the local church, a respected figure in the community, known for her stories of faith and superstition. Perhaps it informed something, or at least could offer comfort that science could not explain. Before leaving, he opened a drawer to check the mask. The wood was damp, as if it had been dipped in the sea, and the crack in the smile widened, revealing a dark interior that seemed to pulse. As he touched the surface, he felt a cold shock, as if the mask had sucked the heat from his fingers. Then something new, a tiny, almost invisible inscription appeared inside the wood, engraved in crooked letters. "I see you," he would say. She dropped the mask in the drawer, her heart racing, and locked it with shaking hands. Those words followed her as she grabbed her bag and left, the wind howling like a chorus of muffled voices. The church, built a few kilometers away, a white building with a simple steeple surrounded by oak trees covered in Spanish moss. It was a typical South Florida place, where gospel hymns echoed on Sundays and stories of redemption mixed with coastal legends. She entered, the smell of incense and polished wood calming her nerves for a moment. The woman he was looking for was there, arranging flowers on the altar, a figure with grey hair, skin marked by the sun, and eyes that allowed us to see beyond what was in front of us. "You seem troubled," she said without preamble, her steady voice carrying a southern drawl. She hesitated, then bypassed everything: the mask, the children, the dreams, the sand figure. The woman played in silence, her fingers stopping at the petites of a daisy. "The sea has its guardians," he said at last, "and not all of them are kind. My grandfather spoke of things that washed up on beaches, things that shouldn't be touched." She took a shell amulet suspended from her neck and listened to him. "Take this. I don't know if it will help, but sometimes faith is all we have." She accepted it, the weight of the shells cool against her palm, and thanked her, though skepticism fought against hope in her chest. Back at the house, he hung the amulet on the door, a gesture that seemed small compared to what he was facing. But the night brought cruel proof of its uselessness. He woke up with a start, the dark room vibrating with the sound of waves and feeling something damp next to him. He turned on the lamp, his heart in his throat, and saw the mask on the pillow, the sand running from it like tears. The amulet was on the floor, broken, with shells scattered like knocked-out teeth. She spoke, throwing the mask against the wall, but it fell intact, the smile wider, the black eyes fixed on her. The next day was a blur of fear and determination. Sand now appears in impossible places, in drawers, on the stove, even in the coffee she tried to make, the grains floating to the surface like insects. The phone rang non-stop, but it was just static on the other end, a hiss like voices in dreams. She called her painter friend again, her voice tremendous as she asked him to come. He arrived at dusk, his eyes tired, but carrying an energy she hadn't expected. "I dreamed about him," he said bluntly, "the sand clown. He was calling me." Together, they burned the mask. They took a metal can from the backyard, threw the wood inside, and poured in the kerosene he had brought. But the flames didn't touch her. The fire danced around, licking the can, but the mask remained intact, the sand around it vibrating as if laughing. "This isn't natural," he muttered, stepping back. She stood frozen, the heat of the fire against her face, but the cold of fear taking over her body. The attempt failed, and the waves grew, now mixed with clear voices that whispered through the walls. "I see you. I see you." That night, the dreams returned, more vivid. She was on the beach, the sand clown before her, the holes in its eyes shining with a light that was not of this world. He held out a hand, and the sand rose around him, binding him like chains. He woke up panting, the sheets damp with sand, and ran to the living room. The mask was on the shelf again, the drawer was open, and the radio was playing circus music, slow and distorted. But now there were words, clear and cold. "You brought me back." She fell to her knees, hands on her head, as the voices in the walls grew louder, a chorus that wouldn't stop. The friend returned the next day, pale and shaking. "I can't stop dreaming about him," she said, showing a sketch of him, the sand clown, idyllic to her visions. "He wants something from us." She looked at the drawing, fear mixed with growing anger. "Then let's find out what it is," he replied, stubbornness overcoming fragility. They decided to go to City Hall, look for older records, something that explained the circus and the clown. But as they left, the sand began to move on the ground on its own, forming a circle around them, and through the window, the sand figure was there, closer, the eye holes staring like lights in the mist. The day dawned with a thick fog that enveloped the house like a shroud, the kind of fog that Florida knew well, but that today seemed alive, pulsing against the windows. She woke up with the taste of salt in her mouth, the sheets damp with sweat and sand, the echo of voices in the walls still ringing in her ears. "You brought me back," they repeated, an accusation that had haunted her since the night before. He got up with effort, his body heavy as if carrying the weight of the sea, and went to the living room. The mask was on the shelf. The drawer was open once again. The sand around it formed a perfect circle that seemed to breathe. The radio, now silent, lay on the floor, but the air vibrated with an energy she couldn't ignore. The painter friend arrived early, his eyes sunken and his hands shaking, holding the sketch of the sand clown. "I didn't sleep," he said, his voice hoarse. "He's everywhere I look." She nodded, feeling the same weight, and together they decided they could no longer run away. The attempt to combust the mask failed, the church amulet did not work, and the visions closed around him like a net. They needed concrete answers, something beyond whispered legends and fragmented dreams. City Hall, with its dusty archives and bureaucratic records, was the next stop, a place where Florida's past told, forgotten but perhaps not lost. They emerged into the mist, the wind carrying grains of sand that stung their skin like needles. The way to the town hall was short, but the mist made everything indistinct, the palm trees appearing like crooked shadows, the sound of the waves muffled but omnipresent. He walked beside her, the canvas bag flapping against his hip, the design on his pocket like a talisman that he didn't know if it would protect or condemn them. "Have you ever felt this before?" she asked, breaking the silence. He hesitated, then shook his head. "Not like that. The sea has always had its moods, but this is personal." City Hall was a grey, concrete building with cracks in the walls and an air of abandonment that contrasted with the humid heat outside. Inside, the smell of mold and old paper greeted them, mixed with the hum of an old air conditioner that barely worked. An employee, a middle-aged woman with glasses hanging around her neck, looks up from a stack of forms. "Old files?" he asked, after hearing their vague request. "We have boxes in the back, but no one has touched them in years. Good luck." She gestured to a back door, and they followed, her heart racing with a mix of hope and fear. The warehouse was a maze of crooked shelves and cardboard boxes, or was so dense that it seemed to swallow the dim light from the lamps. They began the search, their fingers turning black with dust as they pulled out folders and ledgers. There were storm reports, fishing licenses, minutes of community meetings, snippets of coastal life that explained nothing. But then, in a box marked only Miscellaneous 1920-1930, she found something. A yellowed envelope, sealed with broken wax, containing a sheaf of handwritten papers. It was a report from a municipal inspector, dated 1926, about Circo das Areias. She read it aloud, her voice tremendous as he listened, his eyes fixed on the sketch he held. The text describes the troupe as a passing curiosity, known for sand sculptures that simply move in the wind. But the focus was on the main clown, an eccentric figure, always masked, who claimed to control the tides. The locals feared him, believing he made pacts with the sea to keep storms away. After a night of strong winds, he disappeared, and the circus left without explaining. A wooden mask was found on the beach days later, but no one claimed it. The report ended with a note. Fishermen say he was a guardian, trapped between land and sea. Messing with his remains brings bad luck. She stopped, the silence weighing between them. A guardian, he muttered, frowning. So the mask is his, and you woke him up. She nodded, the weight of those pivotal words in her chest. But there was more. At the bottom of the envelope, an ink drawing showed the clown. Tall, gangly, with holes in his eyes and a crooked smile. It was identical to the sand figure that was chasing them. He never left, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. And now you're here because of me. They decided to take the envelope, but when they left the warehouse, the air changed. The sound of waves grew louder, echoing off the walls as if the building were submerged, and sand began to leak from cracks in the concrete, forming mounds that moved on their own. The employee mentioned running to the exit, but they stayed paralyzed as the fog invaded the hallway. The sand figure appeared at the end of the hall, its eye holes glowing in the dim light, and the voices returned. "You brought me back." He grabbed her arm, pulling her out, the envelope falling onto the sand that follows them like a living shadow. Back at the house, the sky had darkened, lightning streaking the horizon. They sat at the table, the envelope between them, the drawing of the clown staring back at them like a nightmare mirror. "He wants something," he said, his voice shaking. "But what?" She didn't respond, her eyes fixed on the mask, now on the shelf. The crack in her smile, almost a laugh. The phone rang, the static screeching like voices in dreams, and the radio turned on alone. The circus music mixed with a roar that sounded like the raging sea. That night, the dreams were worse. She was on the beach, the sand clown before her, the sand rising around her like hands pulling her down. He spoke, his voice an echo of 1,000 broken shells. "You trapped me. Now set me free." He woke up with sand in his eyes, the room vibrating with the sound of waves, and found the mask on his head, the inscription, "I see you," now stained red, like dried blood. The friend, who was sleeping on the sofa, was pale, holding a new sketch, the clown, but now with her face reflected in the eye holes. They decided to burn the envelope, hoping that destroying it would sever their ties with the past. But the flames barely touched the paper, and the sand in the house began to pulse, forming figures that collapsed and reformed. Through the window, the beach seemed alive, piles of sand were moving against the wind, and the figure was there, closer, the eye holes fixed on her. "He won't stop," he said, his voice breaking. She nodded, stubbornness fighting against fear. "Then let's go to sea. Let's finish this." They walked out into the darkness, the mask in her hand, the wind roaring like a wounded animal. The beach awaited them, the waves crashing hard, and the sand beneath their feet began to give way, pulling them under. She wanted the mask, ready to throw it off, but the clown appeared before them, real and solid, her voice echoing, "You brought me back. Now take me with you." The sand enveloped them, and she fell, struggling against the weight as he pulled her back, and they both fell into the damp darkness of the night. The darkness swallowed them for an instant that seemed eternal. The weight of the sand sent against their bodies like invisible hands. She felt her scream caught in her throat, suffocated by the salty moisture that invaded her mouth, as her friend pulled her tightly, his fingers digging into her arm. The sound of the waves was deafening, a bone-vibrating roar, and the figure of the sand clown hovered before them, its eye holes shining like lights in the mist. "You brought me back. Now take me with you," his voice echoed, a chorus of broken shells that cut through the air. But then, with an effort that knocked the air from her lungs, she freed herself from the sand that was pulling her, falling to her knees on the beach, her friend at her side, panting and covered in grains that glittered in the moonlight. The mask was in his hands, the wood cold and damp, the crack in his smile now so wide it looked like an open wound. She reached out, arms shaking, and threw her into the waves with all the strength she had left. The water swallowed her, white foam rising as if the sea claimed her. And for a moment, silence fell, heavy, almost solid, broken only by the sound of her ragged breaths. The sandy figure appeared, crumbling into wind-blown mounds, and the mist began to dissipate, revealing the deserted beach, the waves returning to a slow pace. They looked at each other, the problem confusing an uncertainty that they dared not name. They returned home in silence, their feet dragging in the sand that still stuck to their clothes. The sky was slowly lightening, a shade of grey that promised dawn, but the weight of what had happened would follow them like a shadow. Inside the house, the salty smell was weaker. The radio was quiet on the floor. The bookshelf was empty. She fell onto the couch, her body exhausted, while he sat at the table, his eyes fixed on the drawing of the clown he still held. "Is it over?" he asked in a low voice. She wanted to say yes, but the memory of the voice, "Take me with you," stopped her. "I hope so," he replied, but the doubt was there, embedded in his chest. The morning brought a strange calm. The sun broke through the clouds, casting warm rays through the window, and the sound of the waves became distant, natural again. She swept away the sand that still covered the floor, her movements automatic as she tried to regain control. His friend stayed close, helping in silence, but his eyes were distant, lost in something he didn't share. "I'm going home," he said finally, the canvas bag on his shoulder. "If you need, call me." She agreed, grateful for his loyalty, but worried about what dreams were done to his mind. Alone, she tried to get back to her routine. He made coffee, read an art book, but the words escaped him, and the salty smell, although fainter, still hung in the air. Then, at dusk, the radio hissed. Not circus music, but a low sound like water running through old pipes. She turned it off, her heart racing, and decided that I would watch the beach. He grabbed a flashlight and headed out, the warm wind blowing against his face as he walked to the shore. The sand was smooth, the waves were calm, but something glistened at the tide line. He walked closer, stomach churning, and saw it, a piece of the mask, broken but with the black eye intact, staring back at her as if it had never left. He took the fragment home, his hand shaking as he placed it in a metal box that he locked with an old padlock. "You're not coming back," he murmured, but the clown's voice echoed in his mind, a suggestion that needed no sound. That night, the dreams were different. Not the clown, but the sea, infinite and black, calling to her with a voice she almost recognized. He woke up with sand on his feet, even though he hadn't gotten out of bed, and the radio screeched again, a sound like muffled laughter. The following days were a struggle. The sand appeared in subtle places, in the corners of the windows, under the doors, and the sound of the waves returned at night, louder, closer. The friend turned on, the voice tense. "I'm painting him non-stop," he said. "I can't control it." She went to his house, a simple cottage near the pier, and found his studio full of canvases. The sand clown, repeated in versioned clothes, the eye holes fixed on her. He was pale, his fingers were stained with ink, and he murmured, "He wants me to see." She hugged him, feeling guilty for dragging him into this, and promised to find a solution. He decided to seek help from the church again. The grey-haired woman received her with a look that mixed pity and caution. "You messed with what doesn't divert," he said, handing over a new shell amulet. "The sea doesn't forget." She accepted, but when she returned, she found the metal box open, the fragment of the mask on the table, surrounded by pulsing sand. The radio played, circus music mixed with voices. "Take me with you." Through the window, the sand figure stood in the street, more solid, the eye holes shining like full moons. The night brought a storm, lightning lighting up the house as the wind beat against the walls. She locked the fragment in the box again, but the sound of waves grew louder, now inside the room, and the dreams returned, the sea pulling her, the clown laughing in the distance. He woke up with the amulet broken again, sand in his hair, and the phone ringing with static that seemed to whisper his name. The friend appeared at dawn, eyes wild, holding a new painting, her on the beach, the clown by her side. "He's not finished," he said, and she knew it was true. They decided to face the sea once again. They took the box and went to the beach, the dark sky roaring above them. The waves were choppy, crashing hard, and the sand beneath his feet began to give way again. She opened the box, the fragment glistening in the lightning, and threw it into the waters. But the sea returned it, spitting him at his feet, and the sandy figure rose, tall and solid, the voice echoing, "You are mine now." The sand envelops them, pulling them under, and she hides, her screams muffled as he holds her, the two of them falling into the wet darkness. With a final effort, she freed herself, dragging him to shore, the fragment still in the sand. The figure retreated, but the eyes followed it, and the sea roared as if it were alive. They returned home exhausted, the box locked once again, but the sound of the waves didn't stop, and the radio chirped, now with a clear voice, "I'll always come back." She looked out the window, the beach pulsing in the darkness, and knew the battle wasn't over. It had only changed shape. Dawn arrived like a broken promise, the sun struggling to break through a sky full of dark clouds that obviously pulsed with a life of its own. She woke up on the living room floor, her arms sore from fighting the sand the night before, the salty taste still clinging to her tongue. The friend was on the couch, his face pale and his eyes closed in restless sleep, the last painting, her and the clown on the beach, leaning against the wall like a sentence. The metal box with the mask fragment was next to him, the padlock intact, but the sand around it vibrated subtly, as if it were breathing. The sound of the waves echoed in the house, no longer distant but within the walls, a low roar that seemed alive. She screamed slowly, her body protesting with each movement, and went to the kitchen. The radio was quiet, but the salty smell was now mixed with something acrid, like wet metal left in the sun. He prepared a coffee, his shaking hands spilling beans on the counter, and allowed himself to organize his thoughts. The sea had returned the fragment. The sand figure had spoken, "You're mine now," and dreams were pulling her into an abyss she didn't understand. Her stubbornness, that strength that had defined her for decades, still burned, but the fragility she tried to hide grew, whispering that perhaps there was no way out. He looked at his friend, the weight of guilt tightening his chest. He didn't ask for it, but he was caught in the same net. He woke up with a start, his wide eyes fixed on the painting. "He was there again," he murmured, his voice hoarse. "In my dreams, said we can't escape." She agreed, feeling the same echo in her mind, and decided that she would begin one last effort. The church, the city hall, the fire, nothing works. But the city hall report mentioned the clown as a guardian, trapped between land and sea. Maybe the key was there, freeing him, not destroying him. "What if he wants to come back?" she asked, an idea taking shape. "What if we have to take him back to sea, but the right way?" He frowned hesitantly, but loyalty complied. "As?" She took out her notebook, the notes she had scribbled over the months, and reread the passage about the circus. "He controlled the tides," he said. "Maybe it's a ritual, something that binds him back to the sea." They decided to research further, but first I will need to face the fragment. They opened the box, the black eye of the mask, staring at them with an intensity that chilled the blood. The sand around them rose, forming a circle that surrounded them, and the radio chirped, its voice clear. "I'll always be back." The morning passed in a frantic search. She looked through the art books on the shelf, looking for references to coastal rituals, while he drew, not the clown, but the sea, trying to understand what the dreams were showing. He found a book on Florida folklore, a forgotten gift from a student, and read about offerings to the sea, shells, salt, words spoken in the wind. "Maybe that's it," he said, showing the ticket, "an offering to release him." He nodded, but his eyes were distant, locked on something he didn't share. The afternoon brought a storm, the sky roaring as rain lashed the windows. They decided to go to the beach, the box in her hand, her friend carrying a bag with shells collected over the years. The wind pushed them as they walked, the sand stirring like needles, and the sea awaited them, the waves crashing furiously. They stopped at the tide line, the water lapping at their feet, and she opened the box. The fragment flashed in the light of the lightning, and the sandy figure appeared, solid and tall, the eye holes fixed upon her. "You are mine," said the voice, but it deepened the fragment, the voice firm despite the fear. "You are from the sea, synthetic against the wind. Get back there!" He threw shells into the water, offered salt from his bag, and recited words from the book, an ancient prayer of fishermen to weather storms. The friend stayed by her side, his hand on her shoulder, and together they faced the figure. Under the sand, her feet gave way, pulling them down, but she continued, stubbornness overcoming terror. The fragment fell into the waves, and for an instant the sea stood still. The waves froze, the wind fell silent, and the figure collapsed, the grains carried away by the water. They returned home drenched, the silence between them heavy but relieved. The salty smell in the house was fainter, the radio quiet, the sand on the floor still. "Is it over?" he asked, and she nodded, wanting to believe it. He left, promising to call, and she locked the empty box in the closet, her heart lighter, but her eyes fixed on the beach through the window. The night fell calmly, the sound of waves distant, and she slept dreamlessly for the first time in months. But the peace lasted a while. Days later, the radio chirped again, a low sound that wasn't music, but a whisper. "I see you." The sand reappeared subtly in the corners of the house, and the friend turned on, his voice trembling. "He's in the picture again." She went to his studio, finding him surrounded by clown canvases, his black eyes fixed on her. "It's not over," he said, and she felt the weight return. They decided to burn the paintings, hoping that the fire would take what was left, but the flames hesitated, and the sand on the ground vibrated, forming laughing figures. The beach changed in the following days. Mounds of sand move against the wind, and the waves carry broken shells that are obviously rustling. She returned to the church, the gray-haired woman shaking her head. "You let him go, but he doesn't want to go," he said. "Something stick." They gave him one last amulet, but that night he cuts it, and the figure appears in the street, the eye holes glowing. The friend stopped answering, locked in his studio, and she knew I needed to face him alone. On the last day of the year, she went to the beach, the wind howling like a lament. The sand surrounded her, the sea roared, and the figure emerged solid as ever. "You brought me back," he said. "Now live with me." She held on, stubbornness burning, and threw salt into the waves, shouting the words of the ritual. The figure retreated, collapsing, but the sea echoed back, "I always come back." She fell to the sand, exhausted, the victory bitter, knowing the cost had been high, her peace, her friendship, her sanity. Back at the house, the radio crackled sometimes. The sound of the waves came and went, but the sand stopped moving. Their friend reappeared weeks later, eyes tired but alive, and they embraced, a connection forged in fear. She kept the box locked, the fragment lost at sea, and learned to live with the inspiration of the wind, knowing that Florida held secrets that would never sleep. The beach called her at night, but she resisted, her stubbornness winning, the price paid in silence. And so, ladies, the sand has stopped whispering, for now. But tell me, do you think the sand clown is really gone, or does he still lurk in the shadows of Florida beaches, waiting for someone who dares to dig him up again? This story may be over, but the nightmares it leaves behind are just the beginning. If you felt the shiver down your spine, the racing heart, or that feeling that something is watching from the window, then I've done my job. And I want to hear from you. What would you do if you found a mask like this in the sand? Leave your stories, your fears, in the comments below. I read each one, and who knows, your idea will become the next dark tale here on the channel. If you like diving into this abyss with me, don't forget to click the subscribe button on Sinister Smiles. Activate the bell, because every week I bring you more stories that will stay with you long after the lights go out. We are a community of bright souls who are unfamiliar pursuits, and I want you with me on this journey, especially you who know that the best subjects come with a very vivid life experience. Share this video with that friend who loves a good chill, and we'll see you in the next nightmare. Until then, be careful what you unearth. The sea is always listening.